This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by South by Southwest EDU. EWA retains full editorial control over the contents of this podcast. This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In a time of deep political polarization, with millions of students segregated by race and zip codes, few education policy areas are more fraught these days than the school choice movement. Who really benefits from programs like charter schools and vouchers? And how have conservative politicians seized the reins of what was, albeit briefly, a bipartisan movement aimed at improving educational equity? We're going to tackle those questions with today's guest. She is Cara Fitzpatrick, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, story editor for Chalkbeat, and the author of a new book, The Death of Public School. She goes deep into the complex and fascinating history of school choice. Cara, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start at the beginning of this project for you. You could have written a book about, well, a lot of topics. Why this one?
Well, I had been a reporter in Florida for a number of years, and Florida has a long history with school choice. I had been covering segregation actually for a long time. And it was just something that arose from some of the work I did on segregation, where I had questions about families that I saw leave these under-resourced, segregated public schools, and they would go to charter schools or they would go to a private school with the help of a voucher program. And I just kind of had this lingering question of, is this a solution to some of these systemic problems I'm writing about? And where did this all come from?
One of the places that this comes from, at least in the modern era when we think about school choice, is from the work of statistician and economist Milton Friedman. Talk to us about where he figures into this.
So Milton Friedman is one of the names that I think you hear most often in this history, particularly from conservatives. He was a conservative economist. And he wrote an essay in 1955 that basically said that public education is a monopoly. And he thought that was a problem, for one thing. But he proposed a solution, which was to give all families, regardless of income, a voucher to basically pay for education in a marketplace. And at that time, that idea didn't really go anywhere, but that essay tied him essentially to this movement that came later. And he just became one of the leading voices for it.
You described that he did not intend to be the father of the modern school choice movement with this essay. And there's actually a section in your book that I love where you describe that he was working abroad when the essay came out and did not realize that it was seized upon by a very particular group of Americans, and those were segregationists in the South who were opposed to implementing Brown v. Board, which had happened just the year before. Can you go a little further into that? I just found that fascinating.
Yeah, this is one of the areas that I was also very intrigued by, because you do always hear that this started with Milton Friedman. But actually, what's interesting is that these things kind of happen at the same time. Segregationists in the South actually started coming up with some ideas to privatize the public school system, even in the years before Milton Friedman's essay and in the years before Brown versus Board, because they could see Brown coming down the line based on other court cases that involved the universities. And so they were looking for different ways to prevent integration. So actually, some Southerners came up with this idea before Friedman started implementing some of these things, putting laws on the book, essentially to get ready for Brown versus Board. And then Milton writes his essay. Not everyone believes this, but he says that he was a little unaware while writing the essay until the very end that segregationists had sort of gotten there first. And he addresses this in a footnote to the essay, basically saying that he is acknowledging that this is a repugnant use of his idea or of the idea, and saying that he could see why some people would think, well, that's sort of the end of that. But for him, he felt like it was still a worthy idea, even though it was being used by people he disagreed with.
But as you make really clear in your book, and I think this is one of the lessons that carries forward to today, is when people come up with these ideas, they're looking for some kind of imprimatur from a noted scholar, from a researcher. People are going to say, okay, where's the evidence? Where's the backing for this theory? And they want to be able to point to something.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because his essay comes out and this is all still happening in the South. And so segregationists who saw this, not everyone did, but some people saw this essay and they did start saying, "Oh, this isn't racism. This is actually about this other thing. This is about economics." But it was still pretty clearly about racism.
One of the arguments that I've heard recently about how we need to sort of rethink this question about segregation is to remind people that we're not talking about a Southern problem. This is a national problem. And that was true now, and it was certainly true then. And that's why I want to talk to you about your decision to center a lot of this narrative in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. What drove that choice for you?
Well, when I was thinking about how to structure the book and the different places and people to focus on, there are a lot of different stories that you could look at, but I felt like in the modern era, sort of 1990 to now, the real push for it comes from Milwaukee and comes from a particular, even, I mean, down to a person. It comes from Polly Williams, who was a state representative in Wisconsin, and she was a Black Democrat, and she kind of came into this idea of school vouchers with a very different mindset about what the purpose was. And so I thought that this is a really interesting sort of twist if you're starting from a place of, okay, Milton Friedman, but also segregationists, and sort of these larger questions about who the programs are for, who they might be excluding, how they're used. And I just felt like Polly's story was really powerful and spoke to so many different, aspects of this question.
She's a fascinating character, and I'll admit I did not know anything about Polly Williams until I read your book, and I'm embarrassed about that because she deserves to be known, and I'm glad that you were able to give her the space that you gave her.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people actually don't know about Polly Williams, and I did not know a lot about Polly Williams. I think part of that is that she was such a divisive figure. She was very polarizing. She was very opinionated. She was also very unapologetic about the fact that she was really, a lot of her work was centered on Black communities and Black children. And so I think to some extent she gets a little bit lost in the history because she's a hard person to sort of put in a box and sort of square what her role was.
You had a quote from Polly, and I'm just going to read it from here. It said, "If you're drowning and a hand is extended to you, you don't ask if that hand is attached to a Democrat or Republican. From the African American position, at the bottom, looking up, there's not much difference between the Democrats and the Republicans anyway. Whoever is sincere about working with us, our door is open." And I felt like that encapsulated the tension of what was happening in Milwaukee in those years, the question of what do Black children really need to succeed? And her argument was what they needed were well-funded, well-staffed neighborhood schools that understood the needs of these children. And she was willing, at least for a time, to potentially make deals with folks who would give her what she wanted, but maybe not for the reasons she wanted.
Yeah, that really is Polly. She felt a lot of, disappointment with her own party. She felt a lot of disappointment with the Democrats in Wisconsin for not supporting her, not just on school vouchers, but on a lot of other issues before she ever came to the idea of vouchers. She had raised questions, kind of uncomfortable questions about whether or not integration policies were actually doing any good for academic outcomes for Black students. She really attacked integration. And so, she had tried a lot of different things to get the Milwaukee Public Schools to improve specifically for Black students. And so I think part of the reason that she was willing to work with Republicans with whom she disagreed on just about everything else was because she felt like her own party wasn't getting it done.
The earliest examples of school choice that you cite in your book were in states with very rural communities where there simply weren't any local options for the children in places like New Hampshire and Vermont. But you also talk about school choice conceptually as an opportunity for grassroots movements and local engagement where parents have more buy-in, teachers have more say. But some of the biggest developments in school choice depended on who was in the White House or on the Supreme Court. Can you talk about that tension between the federal reach and local control?
Yeah, this is one of the things I thought was sort of interesting because American education, really the hallmark of it is local control. And so many things happen on the local level that dictate how things go in your state or your local community. But for school choice, you had this sort of tension between programs that started on a local level, like Milwaukee's program is the first school voucher program sort of in the modern era. It's just for Milwaukee, but it reverberates nationally. And this fear from opponents of it that if it can happen here, it can happen in other places. And you have presidents weighing in on some of these things, this idea of private school choice versus public school choice, where you had charter schools become a policy that a lot of had bipartisanship behind it, where school vouchers were very closely associated with Republicans. And you had George W. Bush speak out in favor of. So you have this kind of this tension between presidents talking about this issue, but to actually have these things pass, it really has to happen on that local level. And then it becomes a question for the courts. And I don't think I really understood how much I would be writing about legal history when I started the project. And then I came to understand that if you pass a program and we're not sure if it's legal or not, then of course it's going to become an issue for the courts. And so I had to learn a lot of legal history and really kind of understand the role that the US Supreme Court played in saying if these programs are okay or not.
It's incredible to me when you look at the timeline of your book and where things are happening, how much happened on the legal front in the 5 years that you were working on this project.
Yeah, a lot of things happened in the last 5 years.
Well, to be more specific, I'm thinking about taking down the firewall between church and state at the Supreme Court level and saying that public dollars can flow to parochial schools.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important to understand is that it was the Zellman case that said that Cleveland's vouchers were essentially okay in 2002. So that's a long time ago. And there were cases leading up to that were sort of carving out this path to greater state aid to private religious education. But then just in the last few years, the court went even further because before what they were saying with Zellman was, okay, you can give some state money to private religious schools if the parents are kind of acting as this middleman, because no money is going to go from the state to a religious school unless a parent says, this is where I want to send my child. So that's kind of what Zellman did. And then just in the last few years, the court went farther and basically said, if the state is going to provide public benefits, public dollars to secular private schools, then they have to also provide it to the religious schools because otherwise it's religious discrimination. And for part of my reporting, I went and listened to Espinoza, which was one of the cases in the last 5 years. And I thought at the time, well, maybe this will somehow factor into the end of the book. And then, Carson versus Macon happened after that. And so it was a very interesting thing to be trying to write about this stuff as it was happening in real time.
Well, that actually takes me to another question, which is, how do you determine the bookends on a project like this? Where do you decide to start the timeline, which for you essentially was 1950, and you stopped right before the COVID pandemic? What sort of drove that? Was it just the mechanics of the logistics of the reporting, or can you talk a little bit about that decision?
Yeah, it was hard to figure that out. Actually, I struggled a little bit with where to start the book as well, because, you could actually go back to like the founding of the country and look at what did the founding fathers think about how we should set up schools for children. You could look at a couple of town tuitioning programs that exist in New England that were started in the late 1800s. And so I kind of had these questions about, well, what is the starting point? What makes the most sense? And I ended up going with 1950 because you did have the segregationists actively creating these programs. And then you had Milton Friedman's sort of seminal essay. And then you also had another figure that we haven't mentioned, but Virgil Bloom, who was a priest who was talking about religious liberty, which becomes very important just in the last few years, those arguments that he was making in the 50s and 60s. So that was kind of how I came around on the start. The end was especially hard because it was still happening as I was writing the book. The pandemic was ongoing. I actually delayed turning in my book because of the pandemic's effects on my own family, because I had a baby and two kids and no childcare. And so I was watching the pandemic and trying to sort out what its long-term effect was going to be on school choice, but also running into just the realities of book deadlines, which is that it has to be turned in basically a year before it's going to be published. And so that was really hard to figure out. And what I decided was basically that to the extent that I could write about the pandemic, it would have to sort of live in the introduction and in such a way that I could change even just a few words to update all of this legislation that was happening up until whatever sort of the last minute could be called in the publishing world. And so I ended up ending the book in 2019, in part because the pandemic was still happening, and in part because I liked this scene basically where Betsy DeVos is at a school in Milwaukee and she references Polly Williams. And I liked the idea of Betsy DeVos kind of laying out what her vision, but also Republicans' visions for public education, what they thought it was, the future of public ed. And I liked her calling back to Polly Williams, who might not have agreed with that vision. And so I felt like, okay, well, this tells you everything you need to know about where this is going. And then I'll try to use the introduction to say where it is right at this second. But for book publishing, it's really hard to do.
We're talking with Cara Fitzpatrick about her new book, The Death of Public School. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on Apple Podcasts. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. This episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by South by Southwest EDU. Join them March 4th through 7th, 2024 in Austin, Texas, as they tackle the world's most critical social issues through the lens of education. Experience community-driven programming, unparalleled networking opportunities, and unexpected discoveries. Visit southbysouthwestedu.com to discover hundreds of sessions and events already revealed featuring inspiring thought leaders in education. Register today. Cara, if we look at the school choice movement, where it stands right now, with this idea of, as hopeful or optimistic as you may want to call it, that it would help the children who need it the most, where is that needle right now?
Well, so there's been a notable change just in the last few years with the pandemic, where the justification for these programs that really took off, that really was successful in the 1990s and beyond, was that this was going to help sort of the most vulnerable children. You know, it was going to be primarily for low-income students, Black and brown students, students with disabilities. And, some Republicans went so far as to call it a civil rights issue. And now what we've seen is this very strong push towards having universal programs where it's for everyone, regardless of income. And the argument is more about parental freedom, that everyone should have the ability to use their, I put air quotes around their tax dollars to pay for whatever kind of education they feel like their family wants to have that fits their values, whether it's religious schools, whether it's homeschool, whether it's some kind of online program. That shift has really been remarkable in the last few years. And I think we're still seeing how those actual numbers play out. But in some places, we've already seen where a lot of the people who are enrolling in some of these universal programs maybe were already in private school to begin with. And so the state is taking on payments that perhaps the family already was paying. That's been fairly notable to see. And then in some places, programs have become whiter over time. They're not actually primarily for Black and Latino children.
When I think about the title of your book, The Death of Public School, to me, I read it not so much as the death of public school in that these private organizations and initiatives are going to force all public schools out of business and to shutter, but more about the death of the idea of public school, the way we sort of think about it as the cornerstone of American democracy, where theoretically, at least, everyone gets a chance at it.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going for.
Oh, good. All
I'm
right, we're done. Have a good day.
yes, like thank you. High note.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because I think a lot of people actually have not understood that that was sort of the idea that I was going for, that it was not meant to be quite so literal as some people have taken it. I definitely have had some people who I guess think I can't read enrollment reports. It says right in the introduction of the book that the majority of American kids go to public school. So I was really trying to hint at this sort of wonkier, maybe more profound statement about what is a public school and does that change if the government is paying for all of the kids who are attending, say, a Catholic school? Does it change if Florida is paying for homeschoolers to take sort of a la carte classes at a micro school? And that idea, I think, got lost for a few people, but I'm glad that you understood it.
Cara, you're a story editor for Chalkbeat, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you for some advice for some of the journalists who are definitely listening to this podcast. Let's talk for a minute about the importance of precision in language and terminology for education reporters. If I'm writing about school choice, maybe I'm brand new to the beat, what are some fundamental things I should be able to explain clearly to my audience, even if I have to do it in every story that I write?
I think that the terminology is extremely important. And I write a little bit about this in the introduction, this idea of these sort of granular arguments about language. But I do think it's important to understand that when you're talking to advocates, either for traditional public education or for school choice, when someone refers to a public school as a government school, that signals something to you. And it says something about sort of what side they're on, actually. And so I think things like that are important to understand and to be careful about how we use language, because I think that you can understand why someone is using a term without necessarily using the term yourself. And I've seen some arguments go back and forth on what used to be called Twitter about saying that journalists were biased, even if they referred to public schools as public schools. And I think that it's important to understand what those debates are sort of about. And then just the basic terminology, I think that, yes, you have to explain in every story what a charter school is and what a school voucher is and what a tax credit scholarship is and what an education savings account is. And I think that it's important to do that in part because, for a reader, it might be the only story they read about school choice. They may not be familiar with those concepts. And there is a difference actually between some of those things.
When I was a beat reporter in Las Vegas, I think F3 on my keyboard was a charter school is a publicly funded campus that is independently operated and is supposed to have more freedom in hiring, staffing, and curriculum decisions. And I would just hit that over and over again when we were in the throes of this debate. But yeah, definitely that idea of government schools. But also, when you talk about voucher programs, a voucher program is very different from a universal voucher program.
Yeah, and I think probably most education reporters, if they've been doing it for a little while in their state, they probably know all of the ins and outs of their particular program because that's how we cover things. But I think it's also important to know that other states maybe do it a little differently. And in fact, there's a lot of variation between these programs. So when you have, for instance, an opponent say that these programs have no accountability, well, you actually have to look at that because some of the programs have quite a bit of accountability. It may not be the accountability that every person agrees they should have, but some of these programs have a lot of different measures, and maybe the kids take the same state test as the kids in the traditional public school. Maybe they take a different type of test, or maybe the schools are subject to some kind of a financial audit. Maybe they're not. I mean, there's a lot of variation, and I think understanding those things is important because you can run into sort of repeating the things that advocates have told you. And sometimes those things are not correct.
I think another challenge for journalists is to talk about whether charter schools are better or worse than public schools. And the phrase that I see so often in stories when we talk about the research, of course, is mixed bag.
Yes, I kind of hate the mixed bag thing because it doesn't necessarily tell you anything. And I think we also run into that with test score coverage where, it's hard to boil down really complicated results or research into a headline. And so I understand that often we end up saying things are mixed. I think it's really important if we can be as specific as possible about what that mix is. If it's that charter schools on average in this one particular study outperform traditional public schools by a very small amount, and in what ways? In reading and math, what does that look like? I think that's an important thing to be able to say. If there's regional variation, if Boston has really good charter schools compared to another city or state, I just think as specific as we can be is a really good thing for readers.
And then also, how much weight do you give to different kinds of metrics? So, for example, if the point of a charter school was parental satisfaction and they survey all the families and the families say, yeah, I realize the overall reading scores for this school are lower than the school I took my kid out of, but he's happier, he's in a smaller class, his teacher knows his name, and there's more engagement, and I feel safer dropping him off in the morning. I mean, for some families, that's the weight.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important because test scores tell you only so much. And sometimes, just as a parent, I know this, not even as a reporter, sometimes what it's telling you is that there's a lot of test prep happening in the building to get those scores up. And maybe that means that the kids are spending less time on enrichment and less time on art and less time on history. And so there's trade-offs to the way that we measure things. And I think that you have to be aware of that. And often, I think the best way to do it is actually just to talk to families.
If you could bring some story ideas to the table you'd like to see more education reporters doing, I know you do it for a living for Chalkbeat, but give us a couple of freebies, if you will, that you'd like to see people writing about school choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as we go forward with some of these universal programs, I'm really interested in those because I think that they're so new. We know so little about where that's going to go and who it's going to serve and how. One of the stories that was a fairly simple story to do, but that I was really interested in from the Tampa Bay Times a few months back was just actually pointing out that an allowable expense, not even fraud or anything, an allowable expense in Florida's program with the education savings account was that families could pay for like Disney tickets and TVs and paddle boards if they still had money left in their accounts. And small things like that, I think, communicate a lot. And I would be interested then to follow up and see if the state is tracking, and they may not be, but see if the state is tracking, well, then, okay, how many people actually did use it for that? I'm really interested in actually seeing on the ground how some of these things are playing out. Because I went to Florida recently for a book event. And while I was there, I toured a micro school. And it was actually 80% of the kids were homeschool students. And they were just coming like once or twice a week for very particular classes. So maybe for a math class. And they were using education savings accounts to pay for that. And I just thought, just a day in that program would be kind of fascinating about what it's telling you about where education is going.
When the book goes into paperback, is there anything you'd like to add or change?
Well, I would like to update it with all of the legislation that's been happening, and sort of if it's even possible at this, at that point, to say a little bit more about what the pandemic has done or not done. That would be great. But it's still ongoing. We're still I can't put Texas in a book right now because Texas is on its like fourth special session, still duking it out over school vouchers. And the religious charter school issue in Oklahoma is still up in the air. And so this is just kind of my ongoing problem of how I update a book with things that are changing just so rapidly on the ground.
I thought I was going to tell you that you had to make a correction in the book because you said KIPP schools have been around for 30 years. And then I did the math, and then I lay down on the floor in a fetal position and realized how long I've been on the beat.
Yeah, I had, and not to pick on this person because I do love her, but I had a younger reporter than me at a book event tell me she was a little burned out on covering education, or she had in fact burned out on covering education and had switched, and she's a significant amount younger than me. So yeah, I feel you on that.
Cara Fitzpatrick is a story editor at Chalkbeat and the author of The Death of Public School. Cara, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much.
We hope to see Cara and you at EWA's National Seminar. We'll be in Las Vegas starting May 30th, 2024. Keep an eye on the EWA website for more information. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a good week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.